I knew she was cheating on him 3 weeks before he did. Not because I saw them together, not because I read messages, and not because someone told me. I knew because every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., she stopped breathing for 6 seconds, and people don't stop breathing like that unless they're lying to someone they love. And I live right next door. I'm not proud of how much I notice about people, but when you share walls with strangers long enough, those walls start telling you things no one ever says out loud, especially in an old apartment building like ours, where the insulation is uneven, where some parts of the wall are solid concrete and others are hollow for reasons lost to bad renovations and cheaper contractors. Mark and Emily moved in 2 years ago, a quiet couple, polite smiles, predictable routines, the kind of neighbors you forget about because nothing about them ever demands attention, except that I couldn't help noticing how perfectly synchronized their lives were at first. Same schedules, same grocery bags, same tired laughter through the wall on Friday nights. That synchronization broke slowly, not dramatically, which is how betrayals usually start. It began with footsteps. Emily started pacing the bedroom late at night, barefoot, slow, careful steps, the kind people make when they're trying not to wake someone sleeping inches away from them. And through the hollow part of the wall near my bookshelf, I could hear her phone vibrate softly against the nightstand, followed by that sharp inhale she always made before answering quietly, as if air itself could betray her. Mark, on the other hand, slept through everything. I know that because his breathing never changed, deep, steady, loyal in a way she no longer was. At first I told myself it was none of my business, because curiosity can rot you from the inside if you let it. But then came the nights when Emily laughed. Not her normal laugh, not the tired shared laughter of a married woman, but a lower, restrained sound, pressed into a pillow, intimate, private, practiced. And every time she laughed like that, 6 seconds later, she stopped breathing. I timed it without meaning to. I'm good with patterns, always have been, and once you notice something like that, you can't unsee it. The affair wasn't loud, it wasn't messy, it was surgical, calculated, hidden behind routines, and lies stacked neatly like folded laundry. But lies always leave residue, and residue attracts attention. Mine. I started noticing things outside the apartment too. Emily's car stayed parked on the street some evenings while Mark's was gone, which made no sense because she never drove at night, not once in 2 years. Yet suddenly the engine would be warm when I walked past to take out my trash, the hood still radiating heat like a confession that had nowhere to go. Her social media told a quieter story, but a more damning one. She stopped liking Mark's posts entirely, stopped commenting, stopped tagging him, while a new name began appearing everywhere, subtle at first, a casual heart emoji, a private joke hidden in plain sight, a man named Daniel, always early to comment, always late to leave, always reacting within seconds like someone waiting with the app already open. Mark never noticed. Men rarely do when they trust. The real problem started when Mark began changing too. His routine slipped, his footsteps grew heavier, his breathing shallower, and one night I heard him crying in the shower, not sobbing. Just that quiet broken sound people make when they don't want anyone, including themselves, to acknowledge what they already know. He suspected. What he didn't know yet was how deep it went. Because Emily wasn't just cheating on him. She was preparing to erase him. I found that out accidentally, the way the most dangerous truths usually reveal themselves. One afternoon, I was sitting on my balcony, pretending not to listen, when Emily was on her phone outside, pacing, agitated, her voice sharp and stripped of affection, and through the open air I heard words that didn't belong to a normal affair. Words like timeline, insurance, documents, and the phrase that made my stomach tighten. Once he signs, it's done. That wasn't romance. That was strategy. From that moment, I started paying closer attention, not out of kindness, not out of heroism, but because something about the situation felt unfinished, unstable, like a loaded weapon placed gently back into a drawer. Emily's lover wasn't just a secret, he was a plan. Mark, meanwhile, began asking questions in the building, casual ones, awkward ones, the kind people ask when they're hoping someone else will confirm their fear so they don't have to say it out loud. And when he finally knocked on my door one evening, eyes red, voice controlled to the point of cracking. I knew the story had reached the point of no return. He didn't ask if she was cheating. He asked if I had noticed anything strange. I told him the truth, but not all of it. I told him about the late-night calls, the pacing, the laughter, the car, the name Daniel. I didn't tell him about the 6 seconds of silence. I didn't tell him about the word documents. I didn't tell him because by then I had already realized something terrifying. Mark wasn't the victim in the story he thought he was. He was the obstacle. And obstacles, when inconvenient enough, tend to disappear. What Emily didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Mark had already discovered the affair weeks earlier, long before he ever came to my door. And instead of confronting her, instead of exploding, instead of leaving, he did something far colder. He watched, just like I did. Mark started recording everything, her schedules, her lies, her movements. And when he realized she was trying to rush legal paperwork under the guise of financial planning, he let her, signing documents that looked harmless on the surface but were carefully designed to bait her into revealing her endgame. Emily thought she was winning. Daniel thought he was stepping into a life that was already cleared for him. Neither of them realized Mark was building a case so airtight that when it finally closed, it would lock from the outside. The night it ended, there was no shouting, no drama, no violence. Just silence. 6 seconds of it. Then breathing resumed, but it wasn't Emily's this time. It was Mark's, calm, steady, relieved. She moved out 2 weeks later, legally ruined, exposed, her affair documented, her plan dismantled. Daniel gone the moment things became real instead of exciting. Mark stayed. Sometimes I still hear him pacing at night, but now it's different, lighter, like someone walking away instead of circling the same lie. And every once in a while, when I can't sleep, I count my own breaths through the wall, just to remind myself of one simple truth. You can hide an affair from your partner. You can't hide it from the neighbor who knows when you stop breathing. Story 2. I realized she was cheating on her husband the moment she started correcting his memories in front of other people, smiling politely while slowly rewriting his past. Because affairs are rarely about sex, and almost always about control, especially when the liar believes nobody is watching closely enough to notice the cracks forming. I live in a building where people greet each other every morning without ever really looking up, where everyone pretends privacy still exists even though the walls are old, uneven, and full of hollow spaces that carry voices, footsteps, and secrets far better than they should. And over time I learned that if you stay quiet long enough, other people will tell you everything without realizing it. Across the hall from me lived Hannah and Michael, a married couple who looked stable enough to disappear into the background of everyday life. Polite smiles, predictable schedules, shared grocery bags, shared routines, and the kind of quiet relationship that makes outsiders assume nothing interesting ever happens behind the door. For the first year, nothing did. Then Hannah changed, not dramatically, not suddenly, but carefully, in a way that felt intentional rather than emotional, as if she was editing herself rather than reacting to something unexpected. She started leaving the apartment later than usual, always with a reason that sounded reasonable on its own, yet never quite fit when placed next to the others, and she began taking phone calls in the stairwell, positioning herself near the spot where the drywall was thinnest and the acoustics carried sound farther than anyone unfamiliar with the building would expect. Through that wall, through that narrow, hollow space, I heard a version of Hannah that Michael never heard, a voice stripped of domestic patience and filled instead with excitement, irritation, urgency, and anticipation, depending on the night, and the name she whispered into her phone was never her husband's. Michael, meanwhile, stayed consistent, reliable, predictable in the way only people who fully trust their partner can afford to be, and watching that contrast develop felt like watching two timelines slowly drift apart inside the same apartment. The affair itself was not loud, not reckless, not impulsive, because Hannah was not careless, she was methodical, and she treated deception the way some people treat project management, carefully planned, carefully scheduled, and constantly optimized to reduce risk. What made this situation unsettling was not the cheating alone, but the way Hannah began to subtly adjust Michael's perception of reality to protect it, correcting small details in conversations, insisting events had happened differently than he remembered, laughing gently when he questioned her, and framing his confusion as stress, exhaustion, or forgetfulness. And Michael started apologizing. He apologized for misremembering things. He apologized for asking questions. He apologized for sensing distance. That was the moment I knew this story would not end quietly. I did not involve myself immediately, because interference changes outcomes, and I wanted to understand the full shape of what was happening before stepping into it. So instead I listened, observed, and let patterns form naturally, trusting that lies always reveal themselves through repetition. Hannah's lover never came inside the apartment while Michael was home, but he existed everywhere else in her life, embedded in her schedule, reflected in her mood, and visible in her phone habits, which shifted from casual scrolling to constant vigilance, notifications silenced, screen angled away, device never left unattended. Socially, she began detaching from Michael in subtle ways that would go unnoticed individually, but together formed a clear picture of emotional withdrawal, no longer tagging him in photos, no longer referencing shared memories, no longer using we when speaking about plans, as if she was slowly practicing a future where he no longer existed beside her. Michael felt it. He didn't understand it, but he felt it, and that feeling manifested as self-doubt rather than suspicion, because trust, when damaged gradually, rarely transforms into anger at first, and instead turns inward, where it is far more destructive. One evening, Michael stopped me in the hallway, his voice calm but tired, and asked if I had noticed anything strange lately, because he felt like conversations kept slipping out of alignment, like he was always a step behind his own life, and he couldn't tell whether the problem was his memory or his marriage. I told him the truth, but I told it carefully, without accusation, without emotion, and without exaggeration, laying out observations rather than conclusions, because I understood that the most dangerous lies are the ones people willingly defend. I told him about the calls. I told him about the stairwell. I told him about the tone of her voice. I told him that none of it proved anything, but all of it meant something. Michael listened without interrupting, and when he finally nodded, there was no shock on his face, only recognition, as if someone had finally put words to a discomfort he had been carrying alone for too long. What Michael did next surprised me, because instead of confronting Hannah or unraveling emotionally, he adjusted his behavior in small, deliberate ways that mirrored her own tactics, not to manipulate her, but to protect himself from further distortion. He began documenting conversations privately, not recording them, but writing them down immediately afterward, noting dates, phrasing, and details, so that when Hannah later contradicted him, he could quietly verify whether the inconsistency was his or hers. He stopped filling in gaps for her. He stopped smoothing over tension. He stopped apologizing for reactions that made sense. And Hannah noticed. She noticed because control requires feedback, and the moment Michael stopped responding the way she expected, her confidence began to erode, forcing her to escalate her tactics to maintain dominance over the narrative. She became more assertive in her corrections, more dismissive of his concerns, more impatient with questions, and more dependent on her lover for validation, which only deepened her emotional investment in the affair. Eventually, the strain became unsustainable. One night, Hannah accused Michael of being distant, cold, and unsupportive, framing his emotional withdrawal as the problem, and Michael calmly asked her to explain why his memory kept contradicting hers in such specific ways. She couldn't, not convincingly, and in that moment, the illusion collapsed. Hannah confessed, not dramatically, not tearfully, but defensively, framing the affair as a response to neglect, misunderstanding, and emotional distance, attempting one last time to shift responsibility rather than accept it. Michael did not argue. He did not defend himself. He did not raise his voice. He simply told her that the betrayal was painful, but the gaslighting was unforgivable, because love can survive many things, but it cannot survive having reality pulled out from under it. The separation that followed was quiet, but thorough. Friends learned the truth gradually, not through gossip, but through inconsistencies Hannah could no longer control once Michael stopped protecting her image. Her lover disappeared the moment secrecy ended, because secrecy was the only thing holding his interest, and without it, the relationship offered nothing but responsibility. Hannah stayed in the apartment, but she moved through the building differently afterward, quieter, more guarded, aware that the walls had heard her story long before she told it. Michael left 3 months later, not bitter, not broken, but steadier than I had ever seen him, carrying with him the relief that comes from knowing the truth, even when that truth costs you a future you once believed in. And I learned something watching it all unfold from across the hall, listening through walls that remember everything people try to forget. Affairs do not destroy relationships by themselves. They destroy them when the liar decides control matters more than honesty. And karma does not always arrive as punishment. Sometimes karma arrives as clarity, and once clarity settles in, nothing built on lies can survive it. Story 3. I didn't realize I was about to witness the most humiliating affair in our building's history until a woman dressed in a latex rabbit costume, with a bright orange carrot clutched in her hand, climbed out of a second-floor window at 3 in the afternoon, tripped over the hedge, locked eyes with me in pure terror, and ran barefoot down the street like reality itself had finally caught up with her. I have lived in this neighborhood long enough to understand that nothing truly shocking ever announces itself properly, because the most unbelievable moments usually arrive disguised as ordinary afternoons, calm daylight, open curtains, and the false comfort of routine that makes people careless when they should be cautious. They live 2 houses down from me, a respectable family by every external metric that matters to people who like judging stability from a distance, a married couple named Thomas and Rebecca, with a young son, a tidy lawn, matching coffee mugs, and a schedule so predictable that even the mailman stopped paying attention. Thomas worked from home. Rebecca worked part-time. Their son went to elementary school 3 blocks away, and the woman who taught that class was named Melissa. Melissa was not what people imagine when they hear the phrase elementary school teacher, because she did not blend into the background of life the way most adults learn to do, but instead carried herself with an intensity that felt misplaced among crayons, bulletin boards, and laminated alphabets. I noticed her long before I understood her role in the story, because she parked on the street more often than necessary, lingered near Thomas's house longer than seemed appropriate, and smiled in a way that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous, as if she was always performing for an invisible audience. The affair did not begin loudly. It never does. It began with timing. Thomas started walking their son to school, even on days when Rebecca was free, lingering outside the building longer than necessary, always returning home with the faint, unmistakable look of someone who had just been somewhere emotionally intense and was now pretending nothing had happened. Rebecca trusted him. That trust mattered. She trusted him enough to stop checking, stop asking, stop watching. I did not. Not because I suspected anything immediately, but because patterns attract my attention whether I want them to or not. And once patterns form, they rarely dissolve on their own. Thomas began closing his curtains during the day. Not all of them. Just the ones facing the side yard. Just the ones facing my kitchen window. That detail alone meant nothing until it began repeating. What confirmed my suspicion was not what I heard, but what I saw one afternoon while washing dishes, when movement in my peripheral vision pulled my attention toward Thomas's second-floor window at precisely the wrong moment. The curtain moved. Not gently, not casually. It was yanked aside, and for a fraction of a second, I saw Melissa. Not the Melissa parents knew. Not the Melissa who stood in front of children reading from laminated cards. She was dressed in tight black latex, shaped unmistakably like a rabbit costume, ears included, holding a carrot-shaped prop that did not belong in any classroom, her face frozen in a mix of panic and calculation, while Thomas stood behind her pulling at his shirt like a man who had just realized how exposed he truly was. That moment lasted less than a second, but seconds are enough. Because seconds change everything. The reason she ran was not because Rebecca came home early. It was worse. It was because someone else knocked. Hard. Urgent. The kind of knock that does not ask permission. The knock came from the front door, followed by a familiar voice calling Thomas's name. and I recognized it instantly because I had heard it dozens of times before during neighborhood meetings and school fundraisers. It was the school principal. He was there unexpectedly, and suddenly, the affair was no longer private. Melissa did not leave through the door. She climbed out the window. That is what I saw. That is what started everything. After that day, nothing about that house felt stable again. Thomas grew nervous. Rebecca grew confused. Melissa disappeared from the street entirely, and the neighborhood began whispering without realizing it. Rebecca came to me 2 weeks later, not to accuse, not to cry, but to ask a simple question wrapped in 1,000 unspoken fears, asking whether I had seen anything strange lately, because she felt like her marriage had developed cracks she could not explain. I told her the truth. Not immediately, not fully. I told her that Thomas had been acting differently. I told her that someone had been visiting during the day. I did not tell her about the costume. Not yet. Because truth, when delivered too quickly, causes people to reject it entirely. Rebecca did not explode. She withdrew. She began observing. She noticed things she had previously trusted away. Late emails, deleted messages, unexplained schedule changes, the slow erosion of eye contact. And Thomas, sensing the shift, became reckless in a way only guilty people become when they realize their control is slipping. He lied badly. He overexplained. He blamed stress. He blamed work. He blamed Rebecca's imagination. That was his fatal mistake. Because Rebecca was not imagining anything. She was piecing together reality one uncomfortable fragment at a time. The moment everything collapsed was not dramatic. There was no screaming, no confrontation, just a meeting at the school. Rebecca had requested it. Melissa was there. So was the principal. So was Thomas. And so was silence. Rebecca did not accuse. She did not insult. She asked questions. Specific questions. About timelines. About access. About boundaries. Melissa broke first. Not by confessing directly, but by panicking, by contradicting herself, by revealing she knew details about Thomas's home life no teacher should ever know. That was enough. The aftermath was slow and surgical. Melissa resigned quietly. Thomas was exposed publicly, not through gossip, but through consequence. Rebecca did not forgive him. She did not humiliate him either. She did something far worse. She told the truth calmly, factually, without emotion, to friends, family, and the people who mattered, stripping the affair of drama and leaving only reality behind. Thomas lost respect before he lost his marriage. And respect is harder to replace. The neighborhood returned to normal eventually. But some images do not leave you. Late afternoons still remind me of that window. That costume. That look of realization when secrecy fails. And I learned something watching it all unfold. Affairs are not destroyed by discovery. They are destroyed by daylight. Because daylight forces people to see themselves clearly. And very few like what they see. I understood that this affair had already crossed into something almost insane when I saw a woman sprint out of my neighbor's side window in broad daylight wearing a glossy latex rabbit costume, clutching a ridiculous orange carrot prop, while looking over her shoulder with the pure panic of someone who had just realized secrecy is a fragile illusion. I have lived on this street for nearly a decade, long enough to learn that respectability is often just a carefully maintained mask. And the families who look the most stable from the outside are often the ones investing the most energy into hiding what would collapse if anyone looked too closely. The family next door fit that description perfectly, because Daniel and Laura were the kind of couple people pointed to when they wanted an example of a successful, responsible life that followed all the expected rules without complaint or visible cracks. They had a young son, a trimmed lawn, polite smiles, and a marriage that appeared boring in a comforting way, which is often how emotional distance disguises itself as maturity to outsiders. Daniel worked from home, Laura worked part-time, and their son attended the local elementary school only a few blocks away, which made everything feel contained, predictable, and safe. The woman who taught their son's class was named Erin, and she was admired by parents for being energetic, creative, and unusually devoted to her work, which in hindsight felt like a polite description hiding something deeply misaligned. I first noticed Erin because she appeared in the neighborhood far more often than necessary. lingering near Daniel's house under the pretense of school conversations, smiling with an intensity that felt rehearsed rather than natural. The affair did not begin loudly or recklessly, because nothing that dangerous ever does, and instead it grew quietly through timing, opportunity, and the shared arrogance of two people who believed themselves smarter than everyone else involved. Daniel began volunteering to walk his son to school, even on days Laura was available, returning home later than usual with the distracted expression of a man who had just been somewhere emotionally charged and was now pretending nothing had happened. That detail alone meant nothing until the afternoon, when everything snapped into focus while I was washing dishes and glanced up at precisely the wrong moment. The curtain was yanked aside violently, and for one frozen second I saw Aaron inside the second-floor room, wearing a tight black latex rabbit costume with ears, while Daniel scrambled behind her, pulling at his clothes with the frantic energy of someone who had underestimated how fragile his secret really was. The moment lasted less than a second, but seconds are enough to permanently alter how you see people. The reason Aaron ran was not because Laura came home early, which would have been bad enough, but because someone else arrived unexpectedly and knocked on the front door with authority. I recognized the voice immediately, because it belonged to the school's assistant principal, a man who had been inside that house before for completely innocent reasons. Panic does strange things to people who believe they are in control, and Erin did not exit through the door like a normal person. She climbed out the window. I watched her scramble across the side yard, latex shining in the daylight, carrot props still in her hand like a surreal symbol of humiliation, while she avoided eye contact and ran barefoot down the street. From that moment forward, the house felt wrong, like a stage after the actors flee but the props remain scattered. Daniel became tense, Laura became confused without knowing why, and Aaron vanished entirely from the neighborhood. 2 weeks later, Laura came to me, not angry and not dramatic, but quietly unsettled, asking whether I had noticed anything strange because she felt like something in her life was slipping out of alignment. I told her the truth carefully, choosing observations over accusations, because people reject facts when they feel attacked. Laura did not panic, but began watching her life closely, noticing deleted messages, guarded phones, schedule changes, and defensive explanations. When she finally confronted Daniel, she did not accuse him of cheating, but asked questions that forced him to contradict himself repeatedly. The truth emerged not as a confession, but as a collapse. The meeting that ended everything took place at the school, in a quiet office filled with educational posters that suddenly felt absurd. Laura asked calm questions, Aaron panicked, and silence settled into the room with finality. No one screamed, no one cried, because the truth had already done its work. The consequences unfolded slowly and methodically. Aaron resigned quietly. Daniel lost his reputation before he lost his marriage. Laura told the truth calmly, factually, and without embellishment. The marriage ended without drama, because clarity leaves no room for performance. Life returned to normal, but some images never leave you. Late afternoons still remind me of that window, that costume, and that moment when secrecy failed. Affairs are not destroyed by discovery alone, but by daylight. And if there is a lesson buried inside all of this, it is not about temptation or weakness, but about the danger of believing that private choices exist in isolation, because they never do. And eventually every hidden decision presses outward until it reshapes the world around it. Story 5. I never planned to become someone who knew too much about other people's lives. But when you live close enough to hear how the walls breathe at night, secrets stop being abstract ideas and start sounding like footsteps, whispers, and pauses that last a second too long. I live alone in a narrow townhouse pressed tightly between two identical buildings, the kind of place where privacy is more of a polite agreement than a physical reality, and where every family pretends they are insulated from their neighbors while accidentally sharing fragments of their lives through thin walls and poorly sealed windows. The family on my right moved in 5 years ago, and from the beginning they looked like the kind of people who believed their lives were orderly because they followed the rules closely enough to never question whether the rules were protecting them or suffocating them. Mark worked in tech and rarely left the house before noon. Julia ran a small interior design business from home, and their son Oliver attended a nearby elementary school where parents waved at each other politely, without ever learning anything meaningful about one another. Their routines were consistent, predictable, and almost aggressively normal, which made the first small irregularities stand out to me more than they probably should have. Mark began walking Oliver to school every morning, even though Julia's schedule was more flexible, and at first that seemed like a father trying to be present, until it became clear that he lingered far longer than necessary, sometimes returning home 40 minutes after a 10-minute walk should have ended. I noticed because I work odd hours, and the quiet of late mornings sharpens your awareness of movement and sound, especially when nothing else is happening. At some point I realized Mark was not just walking Oliver to school, but waiting near the playground fence, waiting near the staff entrance, waiting until a specific woman exited the building. Her name was Emily, and I learned it the same way everyone learns things they were never meant to know, through repetition and accidental exposure rather than intention. She was Oliver's teacher. She was younger than I expected, energetic, overly expressive, and dressed in a way that leaned just far enough outside professional boundaries to still be excusable, which in hindsight felt like a warning sign disguised as confidence. The affair did not announce itself loudly, because affairs rarely do, and instead it revealed itself through micro-adjustments in behavior that only look suspicious once you already understand their meaning. Mark started closing his office door during the day. Julia started asking small questions that were never answered directly. Emily began appearing in the neighborhood during hours when teachers had no logical reason to be anywhere near a residential street. What made everything unmistakable was not the behavior itself, but the way Mark's emotional temperature changed, because guilt does not make people colder, it makes them erratic. Some days he was overly attentive to Julia, other days distant and irritable, swinging between performance and withdrawal with no middle ground. The moment when everything shifted from suspicion into certainty came on a quiet afternoon when the street was empty and the air felt still, the kind of stillness that makes small sounds feel amplified. I was sitting near my window when movement caught my attention, and I saw Emily emerge from Mark and Julia's house, not through the front door, but through the side entrance that faces my building directly. She was not dressed like a teacher. She was wearing a tight latex costume shaped like a stylized rabbit, complete with ears and a glossy surface that reflected sunlight in a way that felt surreal and wrong for the time of day. She was holding a carrot-shaped accessory that looked absurd outside of whatever private context it belonged to. Her face was panicked. She looked back at the house as if something had gone terribly wrong, adjusted her posture, and then ran. Not walked quickly, ran. Moments later, a car pulled into Mark's driveway, not Julia's car, but one I recognized from school events, belonging to the vice principal, who had likely come for a routine conversation or an unexpected check-in. The timing was catastrophic. Emily never looked in my direction, but I watched her disappear down the street, latex squeaking faintly with each step, humiliation clinging to her like a visible aura. Mark did not follow her. Instead, he stood frozen behind the glass door for several seconds before pulling the blinds shut with a violence that felt less like panic and more like rage at being exposed by circumstance rather than choice. For days afterward, the house felt wrong. Not loud, not chaotic, just wrong in a way that made the air feel heavier. Julia sensed it before she understood it, and I could tell by the way she paused in the driveway sometimes, staring at nothing, as if listening for something she could not yet name. When she finally came to me, it was not dramatic. She knocked softly. She asked neutral questions. She did not accuse. She wanted context. I told her what I saw without interpretation, without embellishment, because truth does not need decoration when it is specific. She listened quietly. She did not cry. She thanked me. What followed was not a confrontation fueled by anger, but a methodical unthreading of a lie that could no longer support its own weight. Julia began paying attention. Mark began making mistakes. Emily stopped responding to messages. The school noticed inconsistencies. Parents noticed tension. The collapse did not happen in one explosive moment, but in a slow sequence of realizations that left no room for denial. Julia confronted Mark not with accusations, but with timelines that did not align and details he could not explain without contradicting himself. Emily was called into meetings that felt increasingly uncomfortable. Boundaries were discussed. Records were reviewed. No one screamed. No one was assaulted. No one died. But reputations eroded quietly. Emily resigned before being formally dismissed. Mark lost his marriage not because Julia wanted revenge, but because trust cannot coexist with deliberate deception once it has been fully illuminated. Julia did not expose him publicly. She simply told the truth to the people who asked. The aftermath was not dramatic. It was clean, which somehow made it more devastating. The house next door eventually emptied. Furniture left. Lights stayed off. The silence returned. Sometimes I still think about that afternoon, about how secrecy collapses not through intention but through chance, and how people build elaborate internal justifications for behavior that unravels the moment it encounters daylight. I did not ruin their lives. I only witnessed what already existed. And if there is one thing I have learned living this close to other people, it is that walls do not protect secrets, they only delay their exposure. I never thought curiosity would feel like a weapon until the day I realized how easily the mind can manufacture evidence where none exists, and how even the most mundane behavior can suddenly appear sinister if you choose to interpret it that way. It started with Marissa, my next-door neighbor, who I had always considered friendly and approachable, the type of woman who smiled at children in the park and exchanged polite pleasantries with other parents during school pickups, seemingly harmless and ordinary in every way. Her husband, Simon, however, had begun noticing patterns that didn't make sense to anyone else, patterns that existed only in the spaces between normal routines, subtle absences, strange phone calls at odd hours, and the way Marissa would sometimes vanish for an hour without explanation while insisting she was merely taking a walk or running errands. Simon's suspicion grew slowly, like a shadow stretching across the floor in the late afternoon sun, starting small and nearly imperceptible until it became a gnawing, constant presence that invaded his thoughts, making him question her honesty, her intentions, and the foundation of trust that had once seemed unshakable in their marriage. He began subtle forms of observation at first, glancing out the window while she left the house, timing her movements, noticing the way her car seemed to appear in different locations than she claimed, cataloging everything mentally with the precision of someone who believed any detail could be a clue to the larger truth. From my vantage point across the narrow street, I started noticing his behavior too. The way he lingered by the garden gate, pretending to water the plants but really peering through the fence. The way he would casually check the mailbox as a pretext to move closer to the sidewalk where he could see her without being obvious. One day, Simon's concern reached a peak because Marissa left the house with a small backpack in the mid-morning light and didn't return for nearly 2 hours. He watched her go, and instead of trusting that she was engaged in some ordinary activity, he followed her discreetly at a distance, keeping his sedan a block behind, careful not to appear threatening or too attentive. Marissa walked briskly at first, then slowed, ducking into a narrow path leading to the city park. Simon's heart began to race, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of anticipation, as if he expected to catch her in the act of something unthinkable. He circled the park, pretending to jog, though his movements were more calculated than casual, always keeping her in view without revealing his presence. The longer he observed, the more anxious he became, convinced that some secret life had been hidden from him for years, that each smile she gave him had been a mask covering duplicity and deceit. Marissa stopped near a grove of trees far from the playground and benches, crouching low, almost as if she were hiding. Simon's chest tightened, because instinctively he felt he was about to witness proof of her betrayal, some scene that would confirm every fear he had allowed to fester over the past weeks. He approached cautiously, keeping his distance, ready to confront whatever he thought he would find. And then he saw her reach into her backpack, pull out a small paper bag, and begin carefully selecting mushrooms scattered on the ground, inspecting each one before placing it into the bag. For a moment, Simon froze, completely disoriented by the simplicity of the scene. He had imagined secrets, lies, and clandestine rendezvous, and instead he saw his wife crouched in the park picking wild mushrooms. She moved slowly and deliberately, as though she were performing a ritual, unaware that anyone could see her. He continued to watch, astonished, as she ate one of the mushrooms, chewing thoughtfully and then smiling softly, as if savoring a secret pleasure that belonged solely to her. Simon's mind raced with confusion, embarrassment, and an almost unbearable relief, realizing that all of his fears were the product of imagination rather than reality. Marissa had not been cheating. She had not been meeting anyone. She had not been hiding messages or lying about her whereabouts. She had been indulging in a peculiar personal habit, something entirely harmless yet intensely private, a passion for eating certain types of raw mushrooms that she considered a meditative experience, a way to connect with nature that no one else in the city understood or approved of. Simon slowly approached her, careful not to startle her. He called her name softly. Marissa looked up, startled at first, then laughed quietly, realizing she had been discovered by the one person who mattered most. Her laughter was nervous but genuine, the tension melting immediately as Simon tried to reconcile the hours of anxiety he had inflicted upon himself with the absurdity of the truth. She explained simply, matter-of-factly, that she preferred this solitary ritual in the park precisely because it was private, because she could enjoy it without judgment, and because it required attention and care that made the rest of the world recede for a little while. Simon felt a surge of guilt so immediate and consuming that it left him almost breathless. Every suspicion, every moment of imagined betrayal, every conversation he had replayed in his head as evidence now seemed ridiculous. He had constructed an elaborate narrative entirely out of fear and imagination, projecting motives where none existed. Over the next few days, Simon found himself observing her differently, not with suspicion, but with curiosity and even admiration, realizing that privacy and secrecy can exist without malice, and that the things people hide from the world are not always sins, but personal pleasures or quirks that society might misunderstand. From my window, I watched him change, slowly lowering the invisible walls he had built around his own assumptions. He apologized softly, acknowledging his misjudgment, and Marissa forgave him, not with dramatic declarations, but with a quiet acceptance that left both of them feeling more human than they had in weeks. In the end, the park became a symbol of something far more profound than fear or suspicion. It became a reminder that we often read stories into other people's actions, assuming the worst because imagination is faster than observation, and that sometimes the most extraordinary mysteries are mundane in reality, existing only in the minds of those who observe too closely. Simon never followed her again, but he learned the value of restraint, the danger of suspicion, and the importance of allowing others to have private joys, even when they seem strange or incomprehensible. And from my kitchen window, I realized how easily human imagination can twist facts into scandal, and how witnessing truth can be both astonishing and humbling. Some afternoons, I see Marissa crouched quietly among the trees, picking mushrooms with the same careful attention as always, unaware of the drama she has unknowingly prevented, and Simon nearby, reading a book or strolling casually. Their relationship restored not by confrontation, but by the simple power of understanding and trust finally corrected.